She's my friend's mom, and every glance feels like the start of something I shouldn't want, but can't resist. The first time I saw her, it felt like stepping into a room where the air had subtly shifted. I had gone to my friend's house on a casual Saturday afternoon. Nothing unusual, just the usual chatter, laughter, and the smell of fresh coffee. But the moment I opened the door and saw her, something quietly, undeniably tugged at me. She was in the kitchen, moving with that effortless grace some people seem to have naturally. Her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands falling softly around her face, and the sunlight through the window caught them just so, giving her an almost ethereal glow. She glanced up, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met. I felt the faintest flutter in my chest, a warmth I couldn't quite place. She smiled, not the polite, fleeting kind, but one that seemed to linger, that suggested she had noticed me noticing her. "You're here early," she said, her voice calm, but with a teasing lilt. There was something in the way she spoke that made ordinary words feel loaded with possibility. I nodded, fumbling for a response, and she laughed lightly, a sound like wind chimes brushing against one another, and my heart skipped again. The first few minutes were harmless, casual conversation. Small talk about the weather, a joke my friend had made earlier, the aroma of her coffee filling the kitchen. But there was something in her presence that made every ordinary detail feel sharper, more vivid. I noticed how her hands moved when she poured the coffee, the soft rustle of her blouse as she leaned forward, the warmth of her eyes as she looked at my friend and then, inadvertently, at me. Each glance, each gesture seemed to linger just a fraction longer than it needed to, and I felt a quiet thrill, aware of it even as I tried to stay composed. At one point, she brushed her hand lightly against my arm as she handed me a cup, a casual, seemingly accidental touch. But it sent a small, electric shock through me, the warmth lingering far longer than the contact itself. I caught myself staring at her a second too long, and she gave me a small, knowing smile, like she had read my thoughts without a word being spoken. Even then, I knew I shouldn't feel this way. She was my friend's mom, elegant, confident, someone whose life experience clearly surpassed mine. And yet, I couldn't ignore the pull, subtle but insistent, that drew me toward her. There was a quiet tension in the room, a gentle undercurrent of curiosity and intrigue. It wasn't overt, it wasn't reckless, but it hummed in the background, in the pauses between our words and the shared glances that lingered just a moment too long. By the time I left that day, the conversation had been ordinary on the surface, but I carried a strange, persistent warmth with me. The memory of her hand brushing mine, the quiet sparkle in her eyes, and the teasing tone in her voice that made my pulse quicken without warning. I wasn't just thinking about her. I was noticing every detail, replaying every gesture. Something had quietly shifted, and I knew, even then, that this seemingly casual visit was only the first chapter in something far more complicated, far more tender, and undeniably magnetic. Over the next few weeks, I found myself running into her more often than I expected. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, seeing her at the grocery store while picking up something for my friend, or waving as she walked her dog in the early evening. But the more these small, unexpected encounters happened, the more I realized it wasn't just chance. Somehow, our lives were intersecting, and each meeting added another layer to a tension I was only beginning to understand. One afternoon, I ran into her in the local bakery. She was reaching for a loaf of bread, her fingers brushing against mine as we both reached for the same package. I felt that same spark from the first meeting, a small, jarring warmth that made my chest tighten and my thoughts stumble. She looked up at me and smiled, that familiar teasing curve of her lips. "Looks like we have similar taste," she said lightly, and I laughed, even as my heart betrayed me by racing. Our conversations were still casual, but I began to notice the subtle ways she made them feel personal. She asked about my day, remembered small details I had mentioned in passing, and sometimes lingered on a word or glance that felt heavier than necessary. There was a softness in her tone, a gentle humor that made me lean in just a little closer, even when I knew I should maintain my composure. Every interaction became a study in subtle intimacy. The tilt of her head, the warmth in her gaze, the way her hair fell across her shoulder as she reached for something. There were moments that caught me entirely off guard. Her hand brushing against my shoulder as she laughed, her fingers resting briefly near mine on the counter. Each touch was fleeting, but I noticed it, memorized it, and carried it with me long after we parted. And it wasn't just the physical proximity, it was the way she seemed to notice me in a way no one else did. I felt seen in a quiet, profound sense, and it was intoxicating. The accidental nature of these encounters only made them more thrilling. When she caught me staring for a second too long, she would give me a small, knowing smile, as if to say, "I see you too." There was a silent conversation happening between us, wordless and delicate, that built tension layer by layer. I could feel it in the way her eyes lingered a fraction too long, in the small, unintentional brush of our hands, in the warmth of her voice as she spoke to me. And yet, there was always an undercurrent of hesitation. I reminded myself constantly, she was my friend's mom, elegant and worldly, someone whose life experience far surpassed mine. But I couldn't ignore the thrill, the pull that drew me closer with each encounter. It was a careful, quiet dance, one step forward, one step back, and I was acutely aware of every nuance. By the end of that week, I realized that I had started to anticipate these small moments. Even the simplest encounters left me feeling lighter, more alive. It was as if she had quietly woven herself into the rhythm of my everyday life, and I couldn't help but notice every detail. The scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the warmth of her presence nearby, the soft hum of her laughter echoing long after she had gone. What had begun as casual coincidence was evolving into something deeper, something unspoken but undeniably magnetic. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, the kind that seemed unremarkable at first glance, that I realized how deeply I was beginning to notice her. We had planned a small gathering at her house with a few friends, nothing formal, just casual chatter, snacks, and the soft hum of background music. But somewhere between laughter and idle conversation, I glimpsed a side of her I hadn't seen before, quiet, subtle, and achingly human. She had excused herself for a moment, and I found her standing by the window, gazing out at the garden as if lost in thought. The sunlight spilled across her face, highlighting the faint lines around her eyes, lines that spoke of years of laughter, of worry, of experiences I could only imagine. There was a softness to her posture, a vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. For a moment, she seemed weightless and heavy all at once, delicate and yet profoundly present. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward her, though I reminded myself silently to stay respectful. Then she spoke, almost to herself, and yet I heard every word. It wasn't a confession in the obvious sense, but a quiet admission of something difficult, a struggle at work, a moment of doubt, the faint ache of loneliness. Her voice wavered slightly, soft and measured, and I felt an unexpected urge to reach out, to offer some comfort. My hand brushed lightly against hers as I passed by, casual but deliberate, and I could feel the warmth of her skin, the subtle tremor in her fingers. It was an intimate gesture, unspoken and understated, but it carried more weight than words ever could. She looked up at me then, eyes locking with mine. There was a quiet recognition in that gaze, an acknowledgement of the small connection that had been growing between us over weeks of accidental encounters and lingering glances. "Thank you," she said softly, not for the gesture itself, but for noticing her in a way few seemed to. Her lips curved slightly, hesitant, as if unsure whether to allow herself to relax in my presence. I felt my chest tighten, the quiet thrum of excitement mingling with concern. We stood like that for a moment, the air between us charged with unspoken words. I could see the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the gentle flicker of her eyelashes as she blinked, and the faint tilt of her head that invited yet warned at the same time. When our hands briefly lingered, it wasn't just contact. It was a bridge between two people who were slowly, quietly recognizing each other in a way that went beyond words. In that instant, I understood something fundamental. Attraction was only one part of this connection. Beneath it lay trust, recognition, and a fragile vulnerability that could only grow in moments like this. I wanted to tread carefully, to honor the delicate line between familiarity and desire. Yet, the sensation of her hand near mine, the warmth radiating through the brief touch, made my thoughts and emotions swirl in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the time we rejoined the others, the moment had passed, but its impact lingered. I carried with me a heightened awareness of her presence, a sense of closeness that was both thrilling and terrifying. What had started as casual intrigue was transforming into something deeper, more intimate, a subtle, unspoken bond that promised connection, understanding, and the slow-building tension of a story that neither of us fully understood. Why it happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where time seems to stretch lazily and the world outside feels distant. I had gone over to help her with a minor household task, something simple, like fixing a loose cabinet door or carrying groceries inside, but the air between us carried a weight that neither of us had acknowledged openly yet. She moved with that same effortless grace I'd noticed from the first day. Every gesture felt deliberate yet natural, as if she existed in perfect harmony with her surroundings. When I handed her a screwdriver, our fingers brushed, not accidentally, not fleetingly, but in a way that made the warmth linger in my palm. I pulled back slightly, pretending it was nothing, but I could feel my pulse racing. She looked up, and there it was again, that quiet, knowing smile, as though she had sensed the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. Conversation flowed easily at first, about mundane things, the best way to tighten the screws, the groceries we had brought, the small frustrations of daily life. And yet, beneath the ordinary words, there was a tension that hummed softly between us. Every glance lasted just a fraction longer than necessary. Every brush of our hands felt electric. Her proximity was intoxicating. The warmth radiating from her, the subtle scent of her perfume that seemed stronger in the small, enclosed space, and the way her hair fell across her shoulder when she leaned down to inspect something. Then, in a quiet moment, our conversation shifted without warning. A simple remark about responsibility and trust somehow morphed into something more personal. Her eyes softened, searching mine as if trying to read the thoughts I'd been too cautious to speak aloud. I could feel the subtle tilt of her head, the slight lift of her brows, and the gentle parting of her lips, all small, unconscious signals that betrayed the calm she tried to maintain. Our hands brushed again, this time deliberately lingering, and the warmth of her touch seemed to press against all the unspoken words between us. I felt the tension coil in my chest, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Every nerve in my body was alert, each subtle movement carrying significance I could hardly ignore. She laughed softly, a sound that vibrated low in my chest, and the way she looked at me, half teasing, half searching, left me caught between desire and restraint. For the first time, I realized how much this was more than a casual attraction. There was a conversation happening in silence, in the brief touches, the lingering gazes, the shared smiles that spoke volumes. It was a confession in disguise, not of words, but of presence, of attention, of subtle signals that revealed more than either of us dared say aloud. As I left that day, the ordinary task we had completed felt secondary to the electric charge that had built between us. My mind replayed every moment, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, the quiet intensity of her gaze, and I understood, more clearly than ever, that we were dancing along a delicate edge. The tension had peaked, but it was beautiful, quiet, and deeply intimate. It was the kind of moment that could easily pass unnoticed by the world, yet had changed something fundamental in both of us. From that day forward, every encounter carried that same weight. Every glance held the memory of that afternoon, and every accidental touch became charged with meaning. The story, I realized, was no longer just mine to observe. It was ours to navigate, slowly, carefully, with the kind of restraint that made the eventual unfolding all the more powerful. Why now? Our encounters had evolved into something that felt almost like a language of its own, subtle, delicate, and charged with quiet intention. It wasn't just her presence that drew me in anymore. It was the way she seemed to understand me, without words, the way a glance or a brush of her hand could convey volumes. I began to realize that the attraction I had been trying to downplay was not one-sided. It was a warm afternoon when the realization hit me fully. I was helping her carry a box of books from the living room to the study. Her hand brushed mine again, deliberate this time, and I felt a small, thrilling jolt run up my arm. She looked at me then, and I noticed a flicker in her eyes, a softness, a hesitation, a recognition of something unspoken. We shared a quiet laugh over the awkward angle of the box, but beneath the humor, there was a silent acknowledgement. We were both aware of the growing tension, and neither of us had yet dared to address it directly. I began noticing every subtle gesture she made, the way she would pause near me, her hand lingering on the edge of a table or lightly touching my shoulder when guiding me through a narrow hallway. The way her perfume seemed to drift toward me, comforting and intoxicating at once. Even her quiet smiles carried a weight I could feel in my chest. I started anticipating these moments, replaying them in my mind, marveling at the way something so simple could feel so significant. There was a stillness in her presence that was both grounding and exhilarating. Sitting together on her porch one evening, sipping tea, we fell into a comfortable silence. She leaned slightly toward me, her knee brushing mine, the warmth radiating between us almost palpable. I could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing, notice the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, and I realized that every detail of her being was imprinting itself on me. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was emotional, intuitive, and profoundly intimate. I sensed that she, too, was wrestling with the same realization. Her fingers would linger near mine on the table. Her gaze would find mine just a fraction longer than necessary, and there was a softness in her voice when she spoke that suggested vulnerability beneath her usual confident exterior. Every interaction became a quiet negotiation of boundaries, a dance of restraint and desire, each moment magnified by the unspoken acknowledgement that we were both aware of what was building between us. Yet, there was also hesitation. I reminded myself constantly, she was my friend's mom, a woman whose life experience far surpassed mine. And still, the pull was undeniable. In these moments, I became acutely aware of how much I wanted to be close to her, to linger in her presence, to explore the depth of this connection, but without rushing, without forcing, without overstepping the delicate line that separated intimacy from impropriety. By the end of that day, I understood that we had crossed an invisible threshold. Our desire was no longer a fleeting, accidental spark. It was a slow-burning flame, subtle but insistent. We were learning each other's rhythms, teasing out boundaries and curiosities alike, creating a tension that was as thrilling as it was tender. And in that realization, there was both excitement and comfort. The quiet knowledge that what had started as a fleeting attraction was quietly evolving into something far more profound, patient, and emotionally resonant. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to soften and even the smallest gestures take on significance. I had stayed late to help her with a minor household task. Nothing urgent, just routine tidying after a busy week. But by the time the work was done, the ordinary air between us had shifted. There was a subtle tension, a quiet electricity that neither of us could ignore any longer. We sat on the couch, not far apart, each holding a cup of tea. The soft lamplight cast a golden hue across her face, illuminating the gentle curve of her smile and the warmth in her eyes. For the first time, I felt that the quiet moments we shared were no longer merely coincidences or fleeting touches. They were intentional, unspoken conversations of the heart. She shifted slightly, bringing her knee near mine, and our fingers brushed accidentally on purpose. I felt a familiar spark, that warmth that had been building over weeks of subtle encounters. But tonight, there was something different, a softness in her gaze, a willingness to linger in the silence with me. It was as if she were saying everything without words, inviting me to cross a line we had both been circling. Her voice broke the quiet, soft and careful. "Sometimes I forget how much I enjoy your company," she said, almost to herself. There was no pretense in her tone, only honesty, quiet, tender, and a little vulnerable. I felt my chest tighten at her words. I wanted to reach for her, to let her feel the same reassurance and warmth she had given me all along. Slowly, deliberately, I let my hand brush against hers, and this time, she didn't pull away. Our hands met fully, fingers intertwining naturally. The touch was gentle but charged, like the unspoken confessions of weeks of stolen glances and lingering touches distilled into a single, deliberate gesture. I felt her warmth, the subtle tremor in her hand, and I realized that this simple connection carried more meaning than any words could. I searched her eyes, seeing there a mixture of vulnerability, hesitation, and desire, a reflection of everything I had been feeling but afraid to admit. We stayed like that for a long moment, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the world outside. Her head tilted slightly, and I noticed how naturally she leaned into the contact, how her presence filled the space around me in a way that was both comforting and intoxicating. Every detail mattered. The warmth of her skin against mine, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her gaze held mine without pressing, without demanding, yet saying everything. She whispered something almost inaudible, but I understood it perfectly, an acknowledgement that the connection we shared was real, mutual, and more profound than we had allowed ourselves to admit. It wasn't a bold confession of love, but it was a promise, quiet, tender, and infinitely powerful. By the time I left that night, I felt the depth of what had shifted between us. The attraction, the subtle tension, the shared glances and fleeting touches had crystallized into an emotional breakthrough. What had been an unspoken dance of curiosity and longing had become something real, something intimate, something beautifully fragile yet undeniable. We both knew there were challenges ahead, boundaries to navigate, and social norms to respect. But in that quiet moment, our hands still intertwined, we had crossed a threshold, one that promised connection, understanding, and the kind of slow-burning romance that could grow, gently, naturally, into something unforgettable. The days that followed our quiet confession were filled with a gentle, almost fragile rhythm. Nothing had changed dramatically on the surface. We still met casually, shared laughs, and engaged in light-hearted conversation. Yet underneath it all, everything had shifted. There was a new awareness in our glances, a subtle weight to every touch, a warmth that lingered long after we parted ways. One afternoon, I found myself at her home again, this time under the pretense of helping her with a minor chore. But the moment I stepped inside, the air felt different, softer, quieter, and somehow more intimate. She was in the kitchen, moving with her usual grace, and when she saw me, a smile spread across her face, gentle and inviting. There was a spark in her eyes that made my pulse quicken, and I realized she had felt the same anticipation that I had carried into this meeting. We started with small talk, the mundane rhythm of everyday life, but each word, each gesture was charged with the quiet understanding that had grown between us. She reached for a cup of tea, and I passed it to her, our fingers brushing lightly. This time, the touch wasn't fleeting or accidental. It lingered, intentional yet delicate, as if both of us were testing the boundaries of a new intimacy. I felt the warmth of her hand, the soft brush of her palm against mine, and a comforting, thrilling sense of connection that made the world outside fade. As we settled into the living room, our conversation slowed, giving way to comfortable silence. She leaned against the arm of the couch, and I found a place beside her. Our shoulders touched, casual proximity that felt natural and right. I could feel the quiet strength in her presence, the subtle steadiness that had drawn me in from the very first encounter. Her head tilted slightly toward me, and when our hands met, it was without hesitation. Fingers intertwined, palms pressing lightly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been quietly forming over weeks of fleeting touches and lingering looks. We laughed softly at nothing in particular, the sound blending with the golden light streaming through the window. She brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. I felt the warmth radiate from her hand into my chest, a gentle, grounding reminder of the tenderness that now defined our connection. Every detail, the soft curve of her smile, the warmth in her gaze, the subtle rhythm of our breathing as we sat together, spoke of a quiet intimacy that had grown from weeks of shared vulnerability and unspoken longing. By the time I left, the afternoon had slipped into evening, but the warmth of our closeness lingered. I realized that this was not a sudden passion, nor an impulsive attraction. It was the natural culmination of countless small moments, each building quietly toward a connection that was both respectful and deeply intimate. We had crossed the threshold from curiosity and tension into something real, tender, and profoundly human. As I walked away, I looked back to see her standing at the doorway, a gentle smile on her face, eyes soft and knowing. There was no need for words. The silence between us said it all. What had started as playful intrigue and cautious fascination had grown into the first chapter of a slow-burning romance, a warm, steady beginning, full of promise, patience, and the quiet thrill of a connection that could last a lifetime.